Welcome to the fluoride debate. A little of the background before I begin. September 5th, we had a community meeting, Meet the Candidates, standing for local MP Wairarapa, and I raised the question to them, would they each oppose the new fluoridation bill, which essentially puts the decision into the hands of the DHBs rather than the councils at a water supply level, if they understood that there was no science behind the idea of a net benefit of fluoridation. Now, I never really got to finish my question at that meeting because a lot of noise and carry on. So I put a post up on one of the Featherston community pages on Facebook. If you know you're from Featherston, when I stated there isn't any evidence whatsoever that fluoride is a nutrient, and numerous studies suggesting it is a neurotoxin, among other toxic effects. My offer to publicly debate anyone on the science still stands, and I made that offer at the community meeting as well. Now, no one took me up on the offer that week. I got a lot of comments on the Facebook page. Here's one by Featherston local Gary Shaw. I'll just read you a paragraph and put the whole lot in the comments below. Okay, strap yourself in. I'm fully aware that engaging in this nonsensical quackery is the only reason this ludicrous non-issue keeps being perpetuated. The best possible thing to do when faced with the groundless claims that fluoridation is a neurotoxin that contributes to cancer, autism, communism, human sacrifice, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria, is to ignore it for the irrelevancy it is. However, I'm terrible at taking my own advice. You get the picture. So no one took me up on the debate, except a week later I got an email or a message on the Facebook page from Ken Perrott. Ken wrote to me and said, yeah, I'll take you up on the debate. And this is what we did. So I suggested a good way to do it would be we each pick a study that we believe fairly strongly indicates either benefit or harm, or at least is a significant study showing either some indication of benefit or some indication of harm, because there's a few studies, but I thought it'd be good to go really deep into a couple studies rather than just pull out a bunch of reviews, because reviews can often be compiled from hundreds of studies, and a lot of those studies could be complete garbage, but the review tends to say, well, if so many studies conclude this, then maybe that's a good conclusion. Better is to look really close at each study, and I think that was a good way to do the debate. So in this debate, we each chose one study. I have to apologise initially, the video quality is fairly poor because my computer's an old 12-year-old desktop and it couldn't cope with recording the feeds via software. So I just pointed the camera at the screen. Unfortunately, right at the end, something happened with Ken's sound feed. It seemed to be cutting back and blotting him out, so you could only hear him intermittently. So I've tried to subtitle Ken's words to the best of my ability, hearing what I believe he said. And at the end of the video, I talk a little about one of the studies that Ken mentions halfway through that at that point I hadn't had a chance to look at, fluoridated milk study. So enjoy the debate. I think it's quite a fun debate. Welcome people to Red Pill Show, episode 2. Today I have with me Ken Perrott, and Ken is a soil scientist with an interest in fluoride in particular. So do you want to tell the folks a little bit about your interest in fluoride, Ken, and how that started?
Well, funnily enough, when I first started out in research, my early papers back in the 60s and early 70s were on fluoride, but not fluoridation. The chemistry of fluoride, and I have more recently, before I retired, did some research on the on fluorosis acid, which is the main fluoridating. What's happening? Fluoridating chemical in utero.
Yep. Yep. Carry on, Ken.
And the thing that amazed me about that experience was that when I was looking for using it as a detractant for heavy metals from biosolids and things like that, and when I analysed it, I found that it was very low in contaminants, which sort of contradicted with the information I had been given by anti-fluoride people. And then I suppose when in Hamilton back in 2010 was it, 13, when the council decided to stop fluoridation despite a referendum which had supported fluoridation, and the scientific aspect allied with the democratic aspect really got me going, and since then I've been keeping up with the research and trying to counter some of the misinformation that's been going on about the issue.
So now we've both decided to discuss some of the science around fluoride today. So we decided we'd look at two papers. There's obviously thousands of papers out there saying different things about fluoride. We thought it would be a good exercise if we each picked one study that we thought demonstrated on the one case benefit and on the other case potential risk or harm. Then we could look at those two studies in a little closer detail. So the study that you chose that you believe demonstrates benefit of fluoride was the Blinkhorn et al. 2015 study. So should we start with that one, Ken?
Well, you can. I don't think there's much in it, except that it does show that it's effective.
So I've got the study here.
Probably the point about putting out that particular paper is that normally you go to reviews for this to get an overview of all the research. But the most recent review, which has got a lot of publicity, the Cochrane review, did not look at more recent papers because it uses a criteria that the communities must have been, the records must have started before the communities were fluoridated or unfluoridated. And Blinkhorn's paper did actually do this, so I'm just using that as a paper which they should have considered if they looked at it a little bit later.
Sure. It's quite interesting, I think, to just look at one paper at a time. By all means, look at the most conclusive ones we can think of. So if we start with Blinkhorn, and we can go through it together, I have some issues with the study in general. So perhaps if I raise one concern, then you can respond rather than me say the whole lot at once. How does that sound?
Yep.
Okay. Now I've put a couple graphs that I took from the data. Now they did cross-sectionally, they did multivariate analysis. Well, I suppose for the viewers I should describe a little bit about the study. They took 3 different areas in Australia, one of which was the town of Gosford, which was in 2008 commenced to fluoridate the water supply. The other town was Wyong, which is another Central Coast suburb, which is about roughly 20 kilometres or 15 to 20 kilometres north of Gosford. And Wyong had been fluoridated for the past 40 years. So those two suburbs of Central Coast, which is just north of Sydney, and then the areas that they chose to compare that were never fluoridated and not fluoridated were Ballina and Byron, which are somewhat, as they described in the study, more rural and less industrialised. And those two suburbs are roughly 500 kilometres right up at the top of New South Wales. So a slightly different climate, being 500 kilometres closer to the equator and more rural. As we can see in this graph here, I'll try and put it in without completely blotting Ken out of the picture. In this graph here, which I did from the data, and I should add that this data was adjusted according to confounders cross-sectionally. So each 2-year time period was somewhat adjusted according to the confounders that they looked at between those population groups that were analysed for, in this case, decayed, missing or filled teeth, nearly 6-year-old children. So this is the unadjusted, raw, crude data, and it does look a little bit different. So in the unadjusted data, you can see this at the top is the non-fluoridated. This one in the middle, that line, is the newly fluoridated town. And in this unadjusted data, the two start out pretty much the same, which was roughly, on average, a mean of 2 decayed, missing or filled teeth at the age of 6. And then the initial drop is quite great here in the newly fluoridated town for the first 2 years, from 208 to 210. While the drop in the Byron and Ballina areas that are not fluoridated was very minor here. And then from 2010 to 2012, the percentage drop of the fillings in the non-fluoridated areas was quite significant. Now, when we allowed for the, when we took into consideration the multivariate analysis, which looked at confounders such as, I've got a list of them here, was the parent of the child a card holder, meaning were they of a lower income, was their maternal country of birth English speaking or non-English speaking, toothbrushing behaviour, did they brush more than twice or more a day or only once or less a day, and so on. Sugary drink consumption, did they have more than one sugary drink a day or no sugary drinks, and so on. So that's how they relatively adjusted cross-sectionally these figures here. So when they adjusted for those confounders, they found that the newly fluoridated area proportionately had a lower level of DMFT teeth than the rural non-fluoridated areas. So when you looked at those confounders, it did make somewhat of a different picture in terms of the results. So you can see there. So when you look at this is probably the most accurate graph we can look at, because they've adjusted as best they can to the variety of different confounders.
You're plotting the ratio there. There's table 5, is it?
Yeah, if you look at the ratio, say, of 2008 on table 3, this is all on from table 3. So table 3.
I don't think that
multivariate analysis of decayed, missing or filled teeth according to year, fluoridation status and socioeconomic characteristics. Table 3. And so if you look at the first fluoridation status, there's the three different statuses: fluoridated, newly fluoridated, unfluoridated. The fluoridated town, they've kept that as the referent, so that remains at 1. And then as adjusted according to confounders, they've found that the newly fluoridated at 2008 sample was 1.47 greater in terms of DMFT than the referent town. So that's how we get that point there, which is exactly 1.47 greater in terms of DMFT than that point there. Does that make sense, Ken?
Yeah.
So this is the adjusted data. And then up here we have the unfluoridated, which is 2.06 of the referent town down here. So if you measure from there to there, that's twice the distance. So when they've adjusted as best they could, which obviously is difficult in a situation where you only have a sample size of essentially 3, but the best they could manage to adjust for confounders had that result. So in terms of looking at the relative drops, this graph is the most useful, right?
Yeah, okay.
So when you look at this graph, you can see that all the towns had a relative drop. So all the regions, I should say, had a relative drop, and I would say quite rapidly and dramatically. I mean, the question is whether or not the samples were, whether or not these these dramatic drops are actually representative of the populations, or whether it's just random sampling error, which is quite possible because they picked 3 different populations at each point. Either way, they're quite dramatic. Would you not agree? They're quite dramatic drops that we're seeing, right? So my first concern is essentially that the change of DMFT rates was not constant. It was changing all over the place. And since these changes had, in these 2 towns, that is in the non-fluoridated and in the always fluoridated town, where there was no change in fluoridation status, in those 2 regions in which there was no change of fluoridation status, the decline in decayed, missing or filled teeth can have nothing to do with fluoridation status in those 2 regions, right? In terms of water fluoridation status.
No. In the unfluoridated areas,
Yep.
the change is not due to fluoridation, but
Right.
the other two.
Right, okay, that's good to hear you agree on that point. So if the change in these two areas was not due to fluoridation, then...
No, there's only one area.
Right, but I know that they're claiming that the change in this town was due to fluoridation, right? Because at this point it wasn't fluoridated, and then it was, so as time progressed, fillings went down, and so they're claiming that change in this town was due to fluoridation, right?
Yeah.
Okay, they can claim that, but what I'm getting at is that if the changes that occurred in these towns, and there's considerable changes, in terms of percentage, overall, this 40% drop is the same as this 40% drop. Between these 2 years is 40% drop. This is also 40% drop. So those changes are equally 40% drops, the major changes I'm talking about. And yet we know that this change was not due to fluoridation status. So my concern is to say that the decline in the newly fluoridated town could at least just as plausibly be explained not by fluoridation, but by the same unknown factors that caused the rapid declines in the other two towns.
Yeah, that figure you've got there doesn't correspond to figure 3, to table 3, because the unfluoridated ratio goes up from 2.06 to 2.81.
Yeah, but these are relative ratios. They're not saying that the ratio of the number of decayed, missing or filled teeth between 2010 was adjusted according to 2008. And that's what I'm trying to say here. That those figures, the adjustments were only done cross-sectionally, not longitudinally.
What table that's coming from?
That's coming from table 3.
Table 3.
Yeah, table 3. But the thing I think you might be missing, Ken, is that the ratios, that is the 1, the 1.47, the 2.06, right? Those ratios apply to the actual measured decayed, missing or filling teeth per group, per area. So they've used the referent town, that is the always fluoridated town, which was fluoridated for 40 years. They've used that as the referent. And so that town, which is Wyong, is unadjusted in comparison to the others because they've just left that at 1, right? But the actual measurement of Wyong, right, is changing, right? So that 1 applies to in 2008 to 1.4, and that's why it's here 1.4, and that 1 applies in 2010 to 0.96, and that 1 in 2012 applies to 0.69, and that's why that figure there is.
We're not looking at table 3.
No, we're looking at table 3 with table 2 sitting right above it, right?
Yeah.
So table 2 is the actual mean DMFT results of each town. Table 2 shows the actual results, so it says 1.4, 2.02, 2.09, and the table 3 is the multivariate analysis cross-sectionally, and that multivariate analysis, those figures of 1, 1.47, 2.06, they apply directly to the means of each town as measured in decayed, missing or filled teeth. And that's how I created that graph. Right?
You haven't got...
Sorry? I didn't hear you, Ken.
Got that. You haven't got the corrected... what you've got for the corrected, after correction for all the other variables,
Yep.
you've got a ratio.
Yep.
The table 2 has not been corrected.
No, table 2 has not been corrected, no.
For data.
Table 2 is just pure crude data. Table 3 shows the ways that raw data would be corrected according to the confounders.
But no, it doesn't. That shows the result after correction, and then using the ratios, you don't know what would it come out of the statistical analysis, whether or not they did actual values or just worked with the ratios, but you wouldn't know what they are.
No, they've.
I think that the key thing is what you're saying is you're saying two things. There's a clear difference, but there's also a difference over time, and in the unfluoridated areas as well.
We may not agree on how they've done their data, but I do believe this is correct. But nevertheless, the point is that my main issue, or my first issue with the study, is that all three towns had a dramatic reduction. The never fluoridated had a 40% reduction from 2010 to 2012, and the newly fluoridated town also had a roughly 40% reduction from 28 to 2010. So, and that's adjusted or not adjusted. That both works out to be around 40%. So, the always fluoridated town and the never fluoridated town both had substantial reductions. I mean, really substantial reductions. So for neither the always fluoridated or the never fluoridated towns could these reductions have anything to do with fluoridation status, because they had no change in fluoridation status. So these...
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So let me respond to that then.
Yeah, sure.
When you take the raw data, you see that there's obviously different effects going on, and so to separate out the effect due to fluoride from other effects, you've got to take the other variables into account. And they've done the best they could there.
Yeah, they have, yeah.
And after doing that, there's still a clear difference.
In all three towns, yeah. Absolutely. And that's why...
Well, no, not in all three towns. The newly fluoridated town, which starts off with, being more similar to the unfluoridated areas, it moves into becoming very close, what's significantly different to the fluoridated area.
And what I'm saying is that both the fluoridated, as we see again, I keep bringing that graph up, but as we see the always fluoridated town also had substantial drops. And so likewise, yes, this newly fluoridated town had a, at this point, roughly 25% greater percent drop at this point, and then slightly less here. But they both those two towns had significant drops as measured in those samples. And as I said, it could be that the samples were, they were random samples, and it wasn't a cohort, so there were a different set of people each time. So it could have been that they just, picked a different bunch of people. But they are significant. Likewise, hugely significant as compared to the newly fluoridated town. The unfluoridated group also had 40% reduction, especially from 2010 to 2012. So it seems to be presumptuous to claim that the reduction in the DMFT here, right, in the newly fluoridated town was due to the fluoride, when a more parsimonious conclusion may be to say that the unknown factors, we don't know what caused this, and we've tried to control for them as best we can, but the drop still happened, even when you controlled for as many confounders as they could think of. The unknown factors which caused this drop is likely to have also caused as much or possibly even all of the drop down here. Because we don't even know what these factors were. We don't know what the factors were here. We don't know what the factors were here. We've tried to account for them by looking at the confounders, such as the parent card holder, are they brushing well, are they drinking sugary drinks, and all of those confounders didn't account for that change. So we have to conclude that there's a huge level of uncertainty about what caused that drop. And if there's a certain uncertainty about what caused that drop and what caused that drop, then if you were to compare the three as three samples, so to speak, because each town is essentially one sample, because you're only looking at whether the fluoridation status was on or off or just turned on. So it's not on an individual level of each individual within the sample. You're looking at the group as a whole, right? Is this group as a whole unfluoridated? Is this group as a whole fluoridated? So you've really only got 3 samples in that sense, and to then state that we don't know what caused that, we don't know what caused that, but we must know what caused that, is disingenuous.
You've got far more than 3 samples. I don't know how many samples there were, but
there was 800 children. I'm not saying there wasn't 800 children, but what I'm saying is that...
Can I reply to you? The whole point of doing statistical analysis is to try and tweeze out these effects. Obviously, between one period and another, you've actually got a different group of children anyway. You may have different methods of measurement. And so the critical thing is the difference, looking at the difference. Not difference between one year and another. I mean, you could be fooling yourself. And this is a criticism that is often made of a lot of these studies. If you're just doing a cross-sectional study, you don't know what the effect is. And if you're just looking at one treatment, say fluoridated treatment over time, the fact that the tooth decay is dropping could be due to other factors. So it's important to have controlled area. Statistical analysis enables you to reduce the other effects, but you still got a difference. And the fact is that the newly fluoridated town, which was quite different to the fluoridated areas, has declined, so there's no significant difference at all. There's obviously, and particularly if you look at rural areas, there'll be other reasons why people have bad teeth, but it does show that there's an effect of fluoridation. Fluoridation doesn't solve all the problems, but it does have an effect.
Well, you may say that it shows that. What I'm saying is that it shows that as measured over those 3 different groups of children over those 3-year periods, there was a reduction in all towns, and it does. As I say, if the question is what caused the drop in each town, and you can't answer what caused the drops in two of those regions, then you have to concede that the possibility is that you also can't answer the question of what caused the drop in the newly fluoridated town. You can't answer that.
You're not looking at the drop over the time. You're looking at the differences between the 3 treatments. And after 4 years, there's no difference between fluoridated and the newly fluoridated foods or towns.
That in itself is something that might happen if you measured these guys in a few years. You know, this drop here that we saw wasn't explained by fluoridation, obviously, because there was no change in water fluoridation. So these drops here also, we can't assume that this drop here, which was the same percentage drop as from starting point as that one was to there, that drop was caused by fluoridation, whereas that drop was caused by something completely different. And it's a really difficult thing when you have a small sample size, essentially of 3, and I know we have a bunch of 100 children.
Sample size of 3.
A sample size of 3 areas. So
you've got that completely wrong. That's sample size of 3. It's a treatment numbers of 3 treatment.
If I elaborate on what I mean by saying a sample size of 3, the study has 3 areas, right? And they each have a different fluoridation status history. You can't, for instance, control for the fact that the Ballina and Byron towns were more rural and there was a lower population density and there probably would have been less dentists per square kilometre and so on. Those factors that if you wanted to control for those factors, then you'd need to have a larger group that you were looking at multiple areas. You could then control for those, because you can't control for them with only one group that experiences that confounder, such as ruralness.
Yeah, I wasn't taken as a confounder.
No, but we have seen in other situations that ruralness has been shown to have an impact on carries, depending on towns being further away from dental clinics and so on. So what I'm getting at here is that the study compares just a small number of cities or areas and looks at before fluoridation and after fluoridation. And so they're crippled by essentially a tiny effective sample size. That is the number of cities. There's one city per group. And the fact that carries is a multifactorial disease, and there are so many factors that you won't know even if you're missing them, that you need a much larger sample size. For instance, if you had 100 towns and you looked at 50 that were either stopped fluoridation or 50 that started and so on, and you compared the rates over 50 towns, then a lot of those confounders that you can't hope to control for otherwise would potentially be balanced out between those 100 towns.
I'm trying to find what the sample size was.
Well, the sample sizes were around there was about 800 kids in one year, and then there was 500 kids in the unfluoridated year.
We should use sample size to reduce the numbers of treatments.
I'm not suggesting that the number of children wasn't sufficient. That's not what I'm getting at here. What I'm suggesting is that the actual it was compared at the whole level.
Don't use the term sample size because it has a specific meaning.
Very well.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. Well, the number of children measured was 500 in one area, 700 and so on, 800. They were roughly around those levels. Those are the numbers of children that they measured the DMFT. What I'm saying is that examining fluoridation status on the individual level, such as if they would have measured urinary fluoride over a period of time of each of the children, that would have brought it down to the individual level. That would have brought the fluoride status down to the individual level of the child, rather than having each area is simply one area and it's either fluoridated or it's not fluoridated or newly fluoridated. And what I'm getting at, that's when I'm talking about the three samples. When you don't look at the individual level, then in that sense you've reduced yourself down to having what I say is the three samples. You've got this town, this town, and this town, and they either have yes or no in terms of fluoride status. And
okay.
that, yeah.
So it's a different type of study. This is a population study.
Yep, I agree. But all I'm getting at is if you had more populations,
we're talking about a population study is quite different to an individual study. It has its own limitations, but it's what we can go with given the material we have in a particular setup. It's not a laboratory experiment with rats. It's what society has done, and therefore we monitor it and we draw conclusions we can from it.
Yeah.
The conclusion that we get from it is that fluoridation has helped that newly fluoridated town, and comparing that with unfluoridated areas and long fluoridated areas. We can see how that town has converged. So it's become, after 4 years, it's become almost, well, statistically not different from the fluoridated town. The question of what happens over time is a separate issue. The question of why the tooth decay measurements change over time in any specific areas is quite a different issue.
If you had, for instance, a controlled trial where you had a set of children that were drinking water without fluoride added and doing all their cooking in water that didn't have the fluoride added, and then you had another group that were drinking and cooking and having food prepared in water that had the fluoride added, and you could blind between each group, and then you could look at their DMFT results of each group. That would be, I'm sure you will agree, that would be a accurate way of ascertaining for sure that fluoride actually had an effect. And what I'm saying is because in this study, even just the simple fact that we had such a huge drop in one group that wasn't fluoridated at all, that we can't account for. None of the confounders accounted for it. It just happened. Random error of samples being chosen. Who knows? But the fact that just happened and you can't account for it indicates how unreliable, how lacking in being able to provide clear information this kind of study is.
Two different things. You say we can't account for it. We're not actually looking to account for it. Perhaps we should, And a simple thing like the change in population the change in the professionals doing the measurement, things like that could account for it. But I mean, you've got a valid point in that any population study is not like a laboratory rat study. You know, it's not a fully blinded, replicated, controlled study.
Yeah.
You can't do that with community water fluoridation unless you. I mean,
unless you have a very large sample of communities, and you compare.
You can't do that, and ethics would not allow you to control humans in that way. But that sort of thing has been done with, for instance, fluoridated milk, where you can actually have a blinded, controlled, replicated study, and that does show that fluoridated milk is beneficial.
I'd have to look into that study, Ken, so I obviously can't give you an answer on whether or not I believe that study was valid or not.
I can provide you with a link to that study. It is a blinded, replicated, controlled study.
Well, perhaps it would have been. I mean, if you had given me that study instead of Blinkhorn, perhaps we could have been talking about that one right now. But given this was the study you gave me, this is the one I've spent the weekend looking at.
You originally said that there was no science behind for community water fluoridation.
Yep.
And you probably back away from it now.
No, I'm not. I mean, to me, that there shows 3 areas that had dramatic changes in cavity rates, and we can't explain that area. And so my sensible conclusion is to say that you can't definitively explain that area as well. You know, unless you can control very well, or unless you can have a large set of data. Yep.
No one's trying to explain the declines.
That was the idea of it. Fluoride is the idea that you're saying is fluoride explains that decline.
The trial is set up to explain the differences, to look at the differences and see if there's a change in the differences, not to look specifically at what happens over time in an area where there's no inputs like fluoride and how the dental health changes.
And in terms of differences, we don't see a statistical difference. We see a 40% drop over that period in this population, and we see a 40% drop in this population over that period. So we're seeing the same. We're saying, well, there is no difference.
We go from a ratio of 1.47 to 1. This is the newly fluoridated area, which hasn't started yet, has got a 1.47 greater NDFT to decay.
Then
it goes to 1.41 2 years' time and 1.11 in 4 years' time, and that is not statistically different to the control area, to the fluoridated area.
Yeah, but as I said, those multivariate analyses are ratios between the towns. They don't take into consideration that the referent town is steadily dropping as well. And when you take those into consideration,
you're talking about one thing, I'm talking about another. We're not going to come to an agreement on that. It would be interesting to look at why these measurements change over time. But the point is the differences between the 3 different towns are there, and they what gives us some confidence that community fluoridation, even in 4 years, has a significant effect.
But they don't describe that effect or that drop in observed carries in those 3 populations. They don't describe that effect was caused by the F status. It doesn't actually describe that.
I'm talking about the difference. You're talking about the decline over time. They're different things, but I don't think we can make any progress on that. The differences are clear, and that's what comes out of the paper. The factors affecting decline or changes over time are a different thing, and I think we move on, because otherwise we're going around in circles.
We probably are going around in circles, but we are looking at differences between towns. But as I've said, and as we've looked at, the towns also have a number of differences not relating to fluoridation status, such as ruralness, such as climate, such as geography, such as demographics. They all have so many differences between each other that that the question of what caused what is literally impossible to answer. That's all I'm trying to say. To conclude from these sets of data that this change here happened by goodness knows what. I mean, one could almost say, well, if a new brand of milk drink came out in 2008 and that got popular, well, then you could say, well, that's what caused this drop here, because all of a sudden people were drinking this new flavoured milk or whatever. I mean, there's so many factors that could have caused that drop there. So many factors that likewise could have caused that drop there. Likewise could have caused that drop there. And that's all I'm saying. Unless you have a randomised controlled trial, and you said you said that wouldn't be ethical. You said that wouldn't be ethical. But I wonder why would it not be ethical to
let on with a randomised controlled trial, which anti-fluoride people say, why don't you do that? My answer is why don't you do that? Because I mean, there's supposed to be people who the fact that it hasn't been done means it's either impossible to do, or the logistics of doing it are just too extreme. Now, I've only met one guy who claims that he can invent an RCT for fluoridation. Osmunson, the Canadian guy. Anyway,
right.
His solution is that when a town is set up, you have a separate reticulation system for the house. So the people in the house and everybody else doesn't know what particular reticulation system they have. So you blind it that way.
Yep.
Now, that to me just seems you're not going to convince any governing authority to set that up. Whereas with a thing like mouthwash or with fluoridated milk, and you've got school children, and you can actually set up a proper blinded trial where kids are chosen randomly, and they're randomly given either fluoridated milk or non-fluoridated milk, and everybody's blindfolded over this. You can do an RCT, and it's been done.
Well, I'm just regretful that you didn't choose that one. I mean, we can't go back in time, because I would have loved to have looked at that one in detail, because frankly, this one, as I said, it's just all over the place. It's all over the place, Ken.
Let's not go back to that, because the criticism you make of a population trial, it will apply to all such population trials.
Unless you had a larger sample of populations. Like I said, if you had 100 towns, say, and you had 50 of them that started or stopped fluoridation while the others didn't, and then you standardise surveys in those 100 towns before and after, you could potentially control for the confounders and hope that those uncontrolled factors vary between the towns would balance each other out, right? Because if you have enough different towns, then you could...
There's a lot of nonsense in the potentially. The fact is that...
it's not... Nothing's perfect, but I'm just saying if you did have a larger number of towns, because the other thing to note here is that these figures are different to the Australian average, which I did another version of the graph here, and you can see, well, those are the three towns, as you can see. This is the Australian average, which is actually going slightly up over those two periods between 08 and 10. So those three towns, not only were they different to the Australian averages, which were going on the whole slightly up, and 70% of Australia is fluoridated. So there's just a lot of variance in those particular areas that could be explained by particular confounders relating to those areas.
Yeah. Okay. So when people undertake this sort of work, they set down registers about how measurements are to be made, which other people in the country don't or won't follow. So you can't compare that sort of data. And they do their best to take all these different confounding factors into account.
Yep, absolutely.
And they come up with the best advice they can from it. And that's how humanity operates. We can never know exactly what the world is like. We can only get a closer and closer approximation to reality.
Yep.
And the fact that we can't, that our picture of reality isn't perfect doesn't mean we should not do things.
I agree, but I agree, Ken, and that's why I would have been interested to look at I would have been far more interested to look at the RCT in terms of the milk, and I'll look into that in future, because if I find that there's something there that's interesting or not interesting, that to me is something that you can potentially draw some conclusions from. All I'm saying is this is very difficult to draw a conclusion from because there's so much going on.
I disagree with you completely. We live in a real world, and we cannot do the perfect experiment for ethical reasons. And we have to
can I ask you what your ethical concerns are?
Warren, can I please finish? We have to do the best we can with the best sort of setup that we can manufacture or incorporate into the system, and society decides whether that advice that comes out of it is reliable enough or not. And we have, there are extensive, there's quite a large number of studies like this, and the conclusions that have been drawn. This is why I said, it's better to look at the review papers, because it's easy to find individual papers and prove one thing or suggest one thing or another. But the reviews have to try and bring all that into account and make an overall conclusion. And the overall conclusion that they are drawing is that fluoridation is effective.
But if each individual study, which they're looking at the conclusions of, if each study looks something like that when you go in depth into it, then a review of 100 studies, such similar studies, doesn't impress me. I need to see a few really solid studies and see, that really has a clear indication that the confounders were, really properly eliminated, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's very convincing. And when you can analyse 100 such convincing articles and then say, well, if 100 really strongly convincing studies show the same conclusion, that's convincing to me. But if you say 100 studies look like this, well, they don't add up to a good argument, right?
Okay, we've gone past that paper.
Okay. All right.
Two different. I've looked at the difference. You've looked at the change over time. They're two separate things. Can we move on?
All right. Okay. I guess we can. I just checked there wasn't anything particularly poignant that I noted. All right, we can move on. So, and I will look into that milk study at some stage. So, right now, if we move on to, I don't know how to pronounce her name. So this is the Rocha et al. 2007, and these guys looked at the comparative effects of both arsenic and fluoride in water in 3 Mexico towns. One of the towns had very low levels of both. Moctezuma had fluoride levels of around 0.8 milligrams per litre. The town of Salitril had 5.3 milligrams per litre, and the highest one, 5 de Febrero, had 9.4. So they're considerable levels of fluoride. Now, the thing that she noted was that the children in the 5 de Febrero town, they tended to drink a combination of bottled water, which was much lower in fluoride. And so the fluoride levels in the urine measure between the children in the Salitril and the 5 de Febrero were close, very similar, because some of the kids were having bottled water. And yet the arsenic was significantly higher in one of the towns over the other. So she had a good set of data to analyse the relationship between arsenic and the relationship between fluoride of intelligence of these children. I'll just read you this little bit here. The levels of children's exposure to fluoride in the present study were higher than in the Chinese studies, and she's talking, I guess, largely about the Zhang studies. Fluoride in drinking water was 3.5 and 6 times higher than the World Health Organization reference guidelines. On average, the fluoride in the urine was 6.6 milligrams per gram creatinine. The individual effect of fluoride in urine indicated that for each milligram increase of fluoride in urine, a decrease of 1.7 points in full IQ might be expected. So that was her conclusion as based for children that were exposed to levels of, in one of the towns where the water was, say, 5.5. Could be, if you think they drink maybe a litre and a half of water a day, we could potentially guess that they might be having 8 milligrams of fluoride. Total fluoride intake depends on how much water they're drinking or how much food they're eating that was prepared in fluoridated water and so on. So one of my points here was that this is from the New Zealand Estimated Dietary Fluoride Intake for New Zealanders, 2009. This is the ESR. And they said that none of the adult daily dietary fluoride intake scenarios exceeded the upper limit when calculated on the basis of unfluoridated water. And the upper limit was, as they calculated, 10 milligrams per day. And then they concluded that when fluoridated water was used, however, roughly 0.1% of diets, which is 1 out of 1,000 in New Zealand, would exceed the upper limit of 10 milligrams per day. So 1,000 people out of 1 million in New Zealand, as estimated by Ministry of Health here, are likely to be exceeding the upper limit of 10 milligrams fluoride total intake per day. And that is, if depending on what we imagine those children to be drinking in Mexico, how much water, if they were drinking 1.5 litres per day, they would be ingesting roughly 7.4 milligrams of fluoride per day. So this is, I know you say these studies in high fluoride areas aren't relating to New Zealand. I'm showing here that they are comparable. The levels are comparable. If you have fluoridated water in New Zealand, as the Ministry of Health did quite a in-depth analysis on what fluoride intakes would be, they did estimate that 1,000 people out of 1 million in New Zealand in fluoridated water areas could be exceeding 10 milligrams per day. And that is a level that is indicated with drops of IQs of those children in Mexico.
We've got way away from that paper now.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. Come back to the paper if you want.
This paper, the Mexican paper, which is also, it's also connected with another paper which came out earlier this year, the same senior author on the
maternal exposure.
No, the in utero exposure. It's a different paper than the one that people are concentrating at the moment, but basically the same story. So it's a bit confusing because one's talking about fluoride intake by parents, mothers, during pregnancy, and others talking about children.
This one's the children one. This is just the children one.
Yeah, okay. Now, the point I want to make is that World Health Organization has put out a general guideline for fluoride intake, and they recommend that drinking water fluoride should be between about 0.5 to 1.5 milligrams of fluoride per litre. Above, I'm not sure, I think it's 0.5 is the lower limit because of dental reasons, and below 1.5 because of problems with fluorosis. So it's a bit disingenuous for people to take studies. I mean, the problem of endemic fluorosis is a big one in the world. It's in some areas, it's a real problem, and it causes a lot of problems. A lot of problems with health, skeletal fluorosis, with with birth weight and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
But it's a separate problem from tooth decay. The thing about this study is that, okay, to start off with, it's not relevant to areas of community water fluoridation. The drinking water levels are far too high. We don't have problems like that in New Zealand. We don't have IQ problems. We don't have severe dental fluorosis. We don't have skeletal fluorosis. But from the point of view of the world, I mean, there's large areas of the world, in India, parts of Europe, China, parts of the Middle East, people do suffer from fluorosis, and that's why it's an area of investigation. The results aren't applicable to New Zealand, but they're of direct concern to those people. Now, the second criticism I would make, and I've sort of wrote a paper on this, talking about some of the work by Choi, is that in areas of endemic fluorosis, people suffer from all sorts of ill health effects. I mean, it's caused by excessive fluoride in the diet, which may be due to other aspects of diet as well as drinking water, but it causes health problems.
Yep.
And one of the problems it causes is a decrease in birth weight and a higher instance of premature births. And both those things can be related to IQ of the child. So my point is that my criticism of a lot of these studies, and it's not relevant to New Zealand, but a lot of these studies, is that they get fixated on a chemical toxicity mechanism. Nothing's been shown to prove that mechanism, but might it not be that in that particular study, the children of the woman with the highest fluoride in the urine were more likely to be premature? Might that not be one of the explanations for what we see in the connection between very high fluoride levels and low IQ? The other, another possible.
I don't know if they confounded for that or not, Ken.
Well, no, they try to, but not very well. But the point they do make is that 34% of the children from these women were premature between 28 and 36 weeks, and their weight was less than 2.5 kilograms.
Can we just confirm that you're talking about the 2007 study?
Yeah.
Yep.
And the average figure in Mexico of premature birth is 7.3. So there is a strong connection there between high fluoride and premature births.
Yep.
I'm not surprised that there's a strong connection between high fluoride.
I just got to let my little girl come into the room. Come on. You want to sit up here, sweetie? All right.
Yeah.
So
no, my point has got nothing to do with fluoridation, but to do with how one interprets that studies, that we shouldn't get fixated on one mechanism or another.
I guess can I respond to you about the birth situation?
The other mechanism I've referred to is the psychological one, and in Africa they talk about fluorosis as being psychological fluorosis because they notice that kids in areas of endemic fluorosis tend to have a lower IQ difficulties and so on. And they put it down to the psychological effect of poor teeth.
My first response is to say that if those levels of fluoride intake per day can lead to this effect happening, whether it's by the IQ of the children being reduced by a neurotoxic effect of the fluoride, or whether it's a secondary response from being premature births that were caused by the higher levels of fluoride in the mother, or whether it's even a psychological response of having severe fluorosis that makes your life difficult in other ways, then regardless what the medium is whereby the higher level of fluoride causes those effects, that those effects are real, right? And so that's
endemic fluorosis.
Yeah, okay, but as we looked at with that comparison that the New Zealand estimated dietary fluoride intake for New Zealanders, they did show that a number of New Zealanders, if they are in a fluoridated area, there will be a certain percentage, it's a small percentage, but there will be a certain number of individuals, as they roughly estimated 1,000 per million, who will be having total intake of fluoride that will exceed the 10 milligram per day limit. And they found that none of the, if you took into consideration a non-fluoridated area, then they didn't find anyone would exceed that limit, because it's just notching down, by not adding it to the water, it's notching down your total fluoride intake to keep it below that upper limit.
If you were going to bring up the question of total dietary intake, because of looked at those that paper and the subsequent nutrient advisory stuff from Australia and New Zealand, we're not doing all this yet. You can't compare total dietary intake for New Zealand with water, drinking water in Mexico. They're different things.
Well, if you know that the amount of fluoride in the water is, in the case of Salotryl, 5 milligrams per litre roughly, and you know that they don't have other sources of fluoride that they're being exposed to, then you can roughly estimate that if they're drinking a litre and a half of water a day, that they're going to get...
just thrown in a whole lot of assumptions that they've got no other dietary intake of fluoride. You're comparing apples and oranges. I think that's the better thing to check is, to what extent do we see these effects of endemic fluorosis? How much severe or even moderate fetal fluorosis do we have in New Zealand?
It may be low, but there are some children who do experience fluorosis at different levels. Yeah.
Severe or moderate fluorosis. This is what the health criteria is. Not mild. Mild fluorosis is not considered a problem. And the data in New Zealand actually does show that the difference between fluoridated and non-fluoridated areas generally is not very large, if at all.
There was three studies that looked into that. The one that you quoted showed very little difference between the fluoridated areas and the unfluoridated areas in New Zealand. Two others showed more of a difference between the two areas.
Yeah.
So, but again, my point is to say that even if fluorosis levels in our unfluoridated areas are at a certain point, my concern is to say, well, if we add fluoride into the water of those areas, the indices of fluorosis that they're already experiencing are likely to be raised up further. And I'd like to go back to that study. When they looked at arsenic, for instance, they found that levels of arsenic 17 to 19 times higher than the World Health Organization limits, right? 17 to 19 times higher, showed a weaker correlation with full IQ reduction than did fluoride levels that were only 3.5 to 6 times the the World Health Organization limits for fluoride. If we are so careful with arsenic that the acceptable limits that we accept from the World Health Organization are 17 to 19 times lower than those that showed statistically less of an effect on IQ than fluoride at only 3.5 to 6 times. My concern here is that we're not having the same level of caution around fluoride that we are around things like arsenic and lead, where the margin of safety is a lot higher, such that if a child, an outlier child in New Zealand, who for whatever reason is experiencing a higher level of fluoride in his diet and in his toothpaste and in his drinking water and so on, that outlier children, that 1 out of 1,000 or so on, will be, as calculated by the New Zealand Health Department, will be likely exceeding the upper limits. That's all I'm saying. Those upper limits... Sorry.
Warren,
yeah.
This is why I suggest that we should have a moderator. You are speaking at a very great length, offering different aspects, jumping from one thing to another, and I prefer if we had shorter bites.
Fair enough.
You're ranting on about your belief about something rather than having an exchange with me.
Okay, point taken. Can you see that we're more cautious with arsenic than we are with fluoride in this instance?
No, I don't agree. That question's got to be put to the health professionals. We have criteria, we have maximum permissible levels of all sorts of different elements in our water supply and so on. I don't agree with you there at all. There's just the difference with fluoride is that we have not, and found any problem with the levels that we have in countries like New Zealand. And the World Health Organization does give a definition of limits, and we're well below that. We don't have any of these effects that, you people want to go on about everything of endemic fluorosis as if they're one of them, but they aren't. We don't have an IQ effect in New Zealand. We don't have dental fluorosis of moderate or severe. We don't have skeletal fluorosis. We don't have all these other crippling effects. You should look at the pictures of people in those areas of endemic fluorosis, and you can tell they're bloody unhealthy. We don't have anything like that in New Zealand. We don't have a problem with endemic fluorosis in New Zealand. And so while these sort of studies are of interest, they're of interest to that sort of area of research, they're not applicable to New Zealand. No matter how hard people may try and make them applicable.
When I look at the levels that the health department said a person on a diet in a fluoridated area could be exceeding the upper limit, they acknowledge that happens, that 10 milligrams per day is going to be exceeded in 1,000 out of every million people in New Zealand. Well, if that's being exceeded,
you wanted to discuss that sort of thing. We should have had the data in front of us. My memory of the ESR work is that the only area of slight concern was that the recommended levels were exceeded for young children in a relatively high number of cases. And the actual document said, despite this, we have no incidences of severe or moderate fluorosis in New Zealand. So it does raise the question of whether or not those levels are too low. The more recent evaluation that has been done by the Australians and New Zealanders have raised those levels because they estimated that a mistake had been made in their calculation, which is slightly mathematical, but so it's more or less taking that into account. But the fact remains that we don't have those health problems in New Zealand.
You referred to a study yourself where other factors affected fluorosis beyond simply fluoride intake, such as total dissolved solids in the water, and zinc was one of them. Right?
Pardon?
You referred to a study online. It was done in the 80s, and they looked at alternate factors that influenced fluorosis beyond merely fluoride exposure. Maybe you've forgotten, but you linked to a study in one of your online discussions that indicated that fluorosis wasn't only something that was related to fluoride exposure, that zinc had an effect on fluorosis levels as well. Maybe.
I don't remember.
Okay, that's okay. So I guess what I'm saying here is that fluorosis itself may be affected by other factors in terms of overall health and so on. So it isn't necessarily the gold standard in terms of measuring exposure to fluoride, right?
It is.
It is the gold standard, right? Well, then, if
because while the 2006 NRC study it was a very wide range, and it pulled out studies where they found harmful effects at higher concentrations of time, but in the end, that they based their decision purely on severe dental fluorosis, that below 2 parts per million there was no severe dental fluorosis, above it there was. So their recommendation for treating fluoride as a contaminant in water was that the limits be lowered from 4 parts per million to 2 parts per million. And that's the criteria which health authorities do use. I mean, Paul Connett and his mates wanted to change the criteria to IQ, and that was the basis of their petition to the EPA. And the EPA went through the petition and argued at every point and said it wasn't acceptable. They had not proven a link between fluoride at these low concentrations in IQ, so there's no point in using that as a criteria.
So, in a nutshell, if we just come back to that study and 07, you don't deny that the correlation between IQ and fluoride levels due to water that is approximately 3 to 5 to 6 times greater than World Health Organization limits does have an effect, or is shown in this instance to be likely to have an effect on IQ. You can acknowledge that it is at that level.
There's an association there, it's not an effect.
No, I know that. I'm not saying that, but an association that appears to be, with an R squared of 17.4, statistically significant, and worth observing the fact that at these levels, at least at these levels, we have indication to have concern of an effect on IQ, whether, as you say, it's by causing premature births or causing people to be depressed about their fluorosis or directly neurotoxic. There is reason to be concerned that those levels affect IQ. Would you agree with that, Ken?
No, there's an association between high levels of fluoride and IQ.
Yep.
And this is one of the reasons why World Health Authority gives the upper limit as 1.5. From a scientific viewpoint, I would say that association is not proof. And I've suggested other non-chemical toxicity mechanisms, but that's beside the point from that point of view.
Yeah. So my concern is that if there is an indication of that relationship, and it's not just that particular study, but other studies that show it, I know that the levels we're talking about are over the mean, levels that are higher than the New Zealand mean. When I read I know we haven't got that one right in front of us, but I printed it out, and their words were quite clear, where they said that 0.1% of people in New Zealand, when their water is fluoridated, will exceed their dietary intake of the upper limit of 10 milligrams per day. So that's all I'm saying. When that happens in 0.1%, then I prefer myself, for instance, not to be in a fluoridated area.
There's a mathematical thing about these question of limits. They're not set at the absolute. They're not saying that absolutely percent of people should be below that. They're saying that something like 98% or something to be below.
Yeah.
It's a mathematical level, and it doesn't mean that somebody who accidentally goes above it or is slightly above it is going to suffer from all these ill effects. The fact is, we don't have these ill effects in New Zealand.
The IQ of someone is something that's so... Firstly, no one goes out and measures their IQ every morning, or we don't measure it, throughout, compare this community to this community and so on. It's something that, if the effect were there and the effect were minor, we wouldn't be able to say, yes, we know it's there. If the effect was incremental, well, we wouldn't necessarily know that. Well, yeah, if they didn't have this happening, then they might have a 5 higher IQ measurement. Well, here's the thing: if people are aware and looking at data that shows these effects happen at these levels, then how do you feel about people saying and concluding, based on the fact that these effects are associated with these levels, well, I'd like to keep to a margin of safety for myself and for my children. I'd like to keep to a margin of safety.
People issue personal approach to things, but what you're saying about fluoride applies just as much as selenium, just as much as iodine, and yet we don't worry about it, do we? We know that if we have too much selenium in our diet, we're going to suffer ill effects. Same with iodine.
Except that we're not getting to. Sorry, keep going.
We're more concerned about having enough in our diet, and yet there will be occasions when, when I was working, we had occasions of kids who were poisoned by selenium because they had access to the stuff that was given to animals.
If I look at arsenic, for instance, which is very well known as a neurotoxin, if you look at the arsenic levels that we're receiving in our water, they are very low. And if you looked at the effect, as I said, the ratio between the levels of arsenic that we're receiving and the levels of arsenic that in this particular study had a correlation with IQ loss, it's over an order of magnitude different. So it's 17 times different. So the difference between what we're getting of arsenic and the level of arsenic that can cause a reduction of IQ is significant. And that makes me feel comfortable about arsenic. I don't go out and worry about my dietary arsenic intake because we're very careful to make sure that the levels of arsenic in water are very low compared to the levels that show harm. And that's what I personally, and I guess my question to you is this: when a lot of people, and there are a lot of people in New Zealand who've looked into these studies and have seen that certain levels of exposure can be associated with certain levels of IQ reduction, and people like me and like a lot of others say, well, I'd like to have a level that's way down here compared to that level that has the observable reduction, rather than edging up halfway, or sometimes if I happen to have a lot of food or water that's fluoridated, I could even sometimes get up to those levels. So a lot of us are wanting to say, well, let's just stay down here. You know, a lot of us can get our teeth strong. I mean, I'm 42, I don't have any fillings. No, well, look, I think we're not going to agree on the studies, Ken, right? I think we can put these down now because you see it differently to how I see it. So maybe to finish the conversation, maybe we can just ask a question about some of the social ramifications or some of the ethics or some of the...
You've raised the question of people, that's a lot of echo there.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you think we'll be done with that?
Sorry, Ken?
I'm picking up a lot of echo.
Right, I don't know if it's not coming from this end.
Okay, well, that's where I'm putting, but yeah, you raised the question of arsenic. Arsenic at Waikato, our source water has a maximum recommended level. It's moved in treatment down to about a third of the recommended. Oh shit, that's bad. But we rely on experts to tell us the recommended level and how much we could go behind. We do that with arsenic at what we do. Why don't we do it with fluoride?
You're cutting out there, Ken, but I think your question was, why do we not trust the experts when it comes to fluoride, but we trust them when it comes to arsenic?
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, if I look at... experts often, under closer examination, experts have made mistakes. We've seen that in the past, historically. We'll certainly see that again in the future. So when I look at the... Yeah. You're cutting out big time.
Yeah, it's I think something wrong on your side, but
I think it's your microphone.
You're going to make the way we treat fluoride. You're going to do the same arsenic or manganese in the water or anything like that.
Well, let's just stick with arsenic because we have, as this study showed, we did see a relationship between arsenic and intelligence. Arsenic is well known as a neurotoxin, so it's a little bit different to talking about manganese and so on. I mean, in terms of the levels, so when we look at arsenic, I do trust the experts. I trust the ways that they've come to those figures, and I feel comfortable about those figures. Looking at the relationship between those levels of what's considered safe arsenic exposure and the studies that show effects of IQ and so on, I feel quite comfortable that there's a good margin of safety, that the experts have got it right around arsenic. And I don't feel as comfortable when I look at the studies that show effect of fluoride on IQ as only being a couple...
Why?
because the margin of safety isn't the same. It's only a factor of 2 or 3 times in some instances. And I know that the levels of exposure of fluoride vary according to how much toothpaste you swallow and so on and so forth. So I just have to say that, and I'm not the only one on this, Ken. There's a lot of us out here who are concerned that when it comes to things like arsenic, we have some really good processes in place to ensure that we're well under the margin of safety. That there's literally no child in New Zealand, or it's very unlikely that a child in New Zealand or an adult is going to approach anywhere near 17 times the limits of arsenic in water.
I don't agree. I often drink Preiss milk because arsenic levels greater than the maximum recommended levels for drinking water. We have arsenic in our diet.
Right, but rice milk, you have a choice to drink rice milk knowing that rice milk tends to be high in arsenic, and you have a choice to drink tea knowing that tea has a high level of fluoride. Right? You don't put that arsenic in the drinking water, and that's all I'm trying to express here, is that there are a lot of people in New Zealand, okay, and I know one might want to throw them in a bucket and say they're all kooks or they're all wackos or whatever, but there are a lot of people who genuinely have concerns about the level of fluoride that they can be receiving from total intake from varying sources, and they want to keep that down with a sufficient margin of safety below the upper limit. And to keep that down sufficiently below that, a lot of us would rather not have it added into the water. And I'm just saying, from that point of view, do you see that there might be a case to say, well, let's listen to these people, that they want to, they want to do what they can to keep their levels within a margin of safety, and not fluoridating the water is one way to do that, and that means also reducing fluorosis.
The question of listening, I think, and I often say this, that the thing about fluoride is it's been one of the most expensive nutrients that we normally use. And I'm thankful to people who raise the problems or the issue. When it comes to a social policy like fluoridated water, if there's a controversy about that, there are some people who don't accept the recommendations. I think it becomes a democracy. And what annoyed me in Hamilton, I think that 70% of the electorate has their support for the council decided to stop. Democratic. Now, what was one of those 30%? I hope that I would be responsible to filter it out of my water. Now, if I'm opposed to fluoridated that the majority want, it's up to me to take responsibility to remove that. And my question is, have to be responsible and certify their own feelings, whether it's a hang-up or real. Why should they then deny what the majority want?
I actually think that it is a good idea, all right, and this is why I opposed the recent amendment bill, because I think it is a good idea for each water supply region. In other words, in here in Wairarapa we have, I think, 3 or 4 water supply regions. So in the South Wairarapa we have one region supplied via Greytown, and as far as I'm aware, that water supply supplies 3 small towns, roughly in a population of about 8,000 people. I'd have to look that up. I agree with you on the democratic choice of this issue. I think that's the healthiest way. We can have communities that are peaceful, that are socially cohesive, and that get on with each other, and that as much as possible running their own lives and making their best decisions. I'm not a fan of over-centralization when you can do things more decentrally. Each area making its own decisions and doing what's best for that area, what they decide to do. I think that's a way toward a more peaceful, cooperative nation, right? And so that's why I'm in favour of councils, water supply regions making that decision for themselves. But the issue I have with the amendment bill is that it takes that decision away from at the water supply point. It takes that decision away from each individual water source because it puts it into the DHB. It puts it into the DHB. Sorry, go.
That decision was taken away from the people of Hamilton by the state required protests and a referendum. As far as consultation is concerned, it should occur at any level by inquiry. That the fact that the DHB may make the ultimate decision does not stop consultation. The Health Committee in Parliament was quite clear about that. The consultation is not written by the full person, but it does make a consideration possibly better because they have better access. The Hamilton City Council didn't know anything about the site, and yet they believe people like people telling absolute lies about the site.
I roughly heard something what you said there, Ken, a little bit of it, that basically you believe that they didn't have the science and so on and so forth, and they made the decision based on the wrong science. Now, we're going to probably have to call it quits because the sound quality's making this pretty much untenable to continue. But the two studies that we looked at, we both see them somewhat differently. We both look at things slightly differently, Ken, and that's something that is representative of the country. A lot of people in New Zealand look at it this way and a lot of people look at it that way. Is there some peaceable solution where people can agree to do things somewhat differently? The best way toward that peaceable solution in my book is to decentralise and allow each water supply point to consult their constituency, the ones that are drinking that water, and make that decision. That's all I can think of. And when the DHB...
That's just a political point, whereas the real not can be quite different. With the tiny, they have that situation where people make decisions in different areas. They can apply it. But then we're going to be able to do that in other areas. Each thing as it comes in the real.
Yeah, I just can't hear enough of what you're saying.
This is more people to be that online game.
Yeah.
Rather than an attempt at this.
No, I think the good point, the way we did it here, Ken, at least some people saw your humanity and they saw my humanity, and that's the bit that is lost when you have an online keyboard debate. People don't see the fact that this is a person with children, this is a person who cares about other people, and that part gets entirely missed. The more communications are online, the more divided as a society we become, and in my mind that's what's leading to what's happening in America with these, bifurcations between people. And I just, to me, doing a video discussion like this, it brings back the human factor. So I'm glad we did this, Ken. We don't agree, but at least we can both agree, both of us are human beings, and when you can see the other as a human being rather than a wacko, that makes a difference. I'm not a wacko. I mean, when someone calls me a wacko because I want to have that margin of safety for my family, well, they're not really seeing me, the reality of who I am and what my concerns are.
Well, right. Vice versa.
Right. Yep, maybe vice versa. So, anyway.
Well, not maybe. You say what I'm called.
You're right. I'm sure. Yeah. Well, again, I don't want to call it to your face right here in a discussion where I can see you, and I think that's more productive. So thanks for discussing this with me, Ken.
Yeah. Really about the sound.
Yeah. Shame about that. I suspect that's your microphone. Or, yeah.
No, it's
Who knows? Yeah.
it's picking up. You've got sound about them.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Who knows what it was? Maybe maybe it's cutting back the sound because it picks it up as an echo.
It only seemed to happen in the last part.
Yeah. That's the surprising bit. Well, thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay? All the best. Okay.
Yeah, you too.
Catch you later. I hope you enjoyed that discussion I had with Ken as much as I did. I've just edited out 15 minutes of silent spaces, ahs and ums, parts where we were misunderstanding what the other intended to say. I made an effort not to take away from the subject matter of what we were talking about or any of the points that either of us were making. Now I've come to read the Stephen study that Ken was referring to, the milk trial for children, fluoridated milk. Every time I look at a new study that someone refers me to, on fluoride for instance, I'm always open to the possibility my mind might be changed, that I might see some very strong evidence that shows fluoride to be a real benefit for human health and that the risks are tiny or that they only happen at much greater levels than that which we're exposing our children to. And truth be told, I'd love it if that were the case. In general, fluoride is being put in the water in New Zealand more than it isn't, and possibly it's going to expand with this new bill that's just coming out. There was a very high dropout rate in the cohort study. It was a 5-year study. It started out with 94 and 93 in each group. 94 in the test group, 93 in the control group. And the last 2 years, the years which actually they imagined they saw a benefit from the fluoride, 44 of the children in the fluoride group, the test group, dropped out. 38 in the control group dropped out. But what's of interest is that the children that dropped out had significantly differing levels of lowercase DMFT at baseline, which is the start of the study. And we know that baseline DMFT is a strong indicator for future dental health. And when you do the math on this, it's quite interesting. The 44 kids that dropped out of the test group had on average 4.66 lowercase DMFT at baseline, while the mean at baseline of the whole 94 was 4.3, which means that accounting for those 44 who left at 4.66, the remaining baseline mean DMFT lowercase in the test group was 3.98 of now a group of 50 children. And in the control group, those that dropped out had a lower baseline DMFT, 3.47, which means that the remaining children in the control group, that was 55 and 56 in 1981, had a mean of roughly 5.2. It's not quite clear what the one child who came back in 1981 had, but it's roughly 5.2 mean baseline DMFT of the control group. Now 5.21 down to 3.98 is roughly a 24% difference. And if this 24% difference in baseline DMFT accounted for a 24% difference in uppercase DMFT at years 4 and 5, then from this study there would only be a remaining approximately 11% difference between the groups. And that's a tiny difference, especially when you consider that the average was around 2 decayed missing or filled teeth per child. So it's only about 0.2 on average reduced decayed missing or filled teeth. That difference could easily also be explained by bias in the examiners, because you see, it wasn't really properly blinded. And this is the same issue that I forgot to mention in the Blinkhorn study that we talked about earlier in the debate, because that also wasn't blinded at all. Examiner bias is a big thing. That could have been, that study earlier, the Blinkhorn one, could have been blinded if the examiners, or a single examiner, examined all the kids via x-ray. If the kids had been x-rayed and then the x-ray sent off to a lab and someone examined the whole lot, not knowing in which group the kids' mouths were from, So that was something that I didn't get around to mentioning in the debate with Ken. Now in this group, they were blinded, but there is another potential situation that could have meant that the examiner would have known which group the kids belonged to, and that's fluorosis. Because you see, the kids in the test group had a dose of 1.5 milligrams of fluoride per day via the milk, right from when they were aged 4.5. And at age 4.5, the enamel hasn't formed yet in the secondary teeth. And it was only, by the way, in the secondary teeth that they scored a difference in DMFT between the groups as they had erupted. Now those secondary teeth would have, in the test group, would have received a large amount of fluoride, a considerable amount, not massive, but enough to cause fluorosis in those secondary teeth. The examiners could well have guessed in which group the child was they were examining. And that may account for a small amount of the difference. And as I said, if potentially a 24% difference could be accounted for by the difference in baseline lowercase DMFT of the children, there's only a tiny difference left over that could be from a result of the fluoride. So there are a number of reasons why these two studies that Ken mentioned don't really show anything much in particular at all. And that's disappointing. I really wish they did. It would relieve a lot of people I know, and we could get on with talking about other things. But they're not showing a benefit. They're just not showing it. And I wouldn't have minded if Ken had chosen this study. We could have talked about this one or any other study he would have chosen. The trend that happens again and again is that I look into the study, I go deeper into it, and I see that it falls apart. They're like a woolen jersey where you've pulled one of the threads and then the whole thing falls to bits. Now the day Ken and I had this discussion, a study came out, a Harvard study, showing correlation between prenatal fluoride exposure and reduced IQ. Lee Wrights had this to say about it. I am not anti-fluoride nor am I pro-fluoride. It is not even a primary interest of mine, but it is something I follow as any intelligent person would, simply because I wish to know what is best for my own health. In regard to the recent Harvard study, I have read objections based primarily on the idea that urinary fluoride is not a reliable measure of fluoride exposure. According to the summary review of health effects associated with hydrogen and related compounds from the EPA 1988, the average urinary fluoride level in the general population without excessive fluoride exposure is 0.61 to 2 milligrams per litre. This is the exact range the Harvard study covers, as can be seen in the chart. And they say right up front, in the general range of exposures reported to other general population samples. Although the EPA publication points out the acid-alkaline condition of the urine can influence this slightly by around 0.14, that is not enough to significantly change the results of this study. They also state that urinary fluoride is a good measure of long-term fluoride exposure. While correlation does not equal causation, neither does it negate it. There is indeed a correlation here, and a very concerning one. The primary suspect is clearly fluoride. Nor does this study stand alone in showing this correlation. It is certainly enough to convince me to pull back from fluoride use, at least until it's sorted out. The objections to this that I have seen are very weak, clearly biased, and show a lack of concern for overall public health. All the best.